Your Royal Highness, Rector Magnifica, please.
Your Royal Highness, Dr. Annan, Dr. Eliasson, Excellencies, learned colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure I welcome you all to Uppsala University and the University Hall. I'm also delighted to welcome our prominent guest, honorary doctors, the former Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dr. Kofi Annan, and the current Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dr. Jan Eliasson. You have both been visiting us at Uppsala University before as Dag Hammarskjöld Memorial Speakers. Dr. Kofi Annan, in 2001, only 5 days prior to the event, the tragic events of 9/11. Dr. Jan Eliasson, in 2011, on the 50th commemoration of Dag Hammarskjöld's passing. Jan Eliasson has, in addition, been a frequent visiting professor and lecturer for the last 25 years. Especially at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research. Also, a warm welcome to Dr. Hans Corell, former Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs and the Legal Council of the United Nations, and one of our alma mater's distinguished alumni. Today is the first day of the semester, and I am particularly pleased that you are all here today. I can't think of a better way to start the academic year at Uppsala University than with today's seminar about the future of the United Nations. I have met Dr. Annan on previous occasions, and he made a deep impression on me with the time and dedication he devoted to the students. In a few minutes, you will be discussing the role of United Nations with a starting point of your own experiences and the challenges of today. When it comes to meeting today's major societal challenges, Uppsala University is a good place to be. Founded in 1477, we are Sweden's first university. We have a long history and many rich traditions, but first and foremost, we are modern, comprehensive, and internationally prominent research university with 3 clear missions. We shall conduct first-class research, provide education of the highest quality, and interact with society. The ultimate goal is to contribute to a better world. One example of how we can contribute to a better world through high-quality research and education is our Rotary International Peace Center. The Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University hosts one of 6 Rotary International Peace Centers that educate students to have a significant positive impact on peace and conflict resolution during their future careers. Another way of contributing to changing the world for the better is by sharing knowledge and create opportunities for developing new ideas and make ways of new discoveries. As what we are about to do here today, I look forward to an interesting discussion this afternoon. Before I give the floor to Professor Wallensteen, who will lead the seminar, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Uppsala Association for International Affairs, Utrikespolitiska föreningen. Albus Bonniers förlag, and Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, who have participated in organizing this event. Now, please, Professor Wallensteen.
Your Royal Highness, Rector Magnifica, Your Excellencies, students, teachers, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great occasion today to have this opportunity to do a public seminar on the topic of the future of the United Nations, reflections based on Kofi Annan's book, Intervention, A Life in Peace, in War and Peace. Indeed, the United Nations is standing at the center of global attention today, given the crisis that we all see daily unfolding. And the UN will play, and I'm quite sure, an important role in handling this matter in as decent a way as possible. So we have with us two extremely knowledgeable persons, as Rector Magnifica just mentioned for us. Let me just tell you how important Uppsala actually is, and how important it is for notable persons to come here and give an address. As the Rector reminded us, Mr. Kofi Annan, before September 11, in the early September 2001, delivered the annual Dag Hammarskjöld lecture. 4 weeks later, it was announced that you, Mr. Annan, would be the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2001. So you are indeed, I think, should be grateful to Uppsala for... Mr. Jan Eliasson, of course, has worked a lot in the UN and as well as being the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs. And the two of you collaborated a lot, particularly in the UN General Assembly 2005-2006, what is often known as the UN Reform Session, where a lot of new initiatives were taken to organize the UN in a new way. You were also here giving, as the Rector just mentioned, the annual Dag Hammarskjöld lecture in 2011. And within 5 months, you were appointed Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations. So there is some magic in talking to an audience in Uppsala. I'm quite convinced, at least we have 2 observations here. So let me now explain how we will proceed. At first, Mr. Annan and Mr. Eliasson will give some reflections on exactly the topic I mentioned, and they will pursue a bilateral discussion for a short period of time among themselves on these topics that this give rise to. I will, excuse me, I will end that at an appropriate time, and then I will invite the audience to put questions to the 2 doctors here on the scene. And I will first invite the Executive Director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, Mrs. Annika Söder, and then the Secretary General of the Swedish UN Association, Ms. Linda Nordin. And after that, I hope we will have questions from the audience, and I will give priority to students asking questions, and I hope we will have time for some lively exchanges. Following this, Dr. Hans Corell will give some concluding remarks from this podium. Mr. Corell, as you just heard, served as Under Secretary General for Legal Affairs, was the legal counsel of the United Nations for 10 years, until 2004. That meant that he has worked closely with Mr. Annan at the UN, so it's the most appropriate. And indeed, these 2 gentlemen were also working together in a very recent mediation in Kenya, as you will remember, after the electoral crisis there. And after this, I will conclude the public seminar. We will have a little ceremony, and I will return with further instructions. So that's how we proceed. So let me now invite Mr. Annan for some introductory comments, and then followed by Mr. Eliasson, and we look forward to hearing more from you. So please, Mr. Annan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, Your Royal Highness, Governor Eckert, Archbishop, and Rector Ackerson. It's really a wonderful occasion for me, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you this afternoon, to be with my good friend, Jan Eliasson. And as you said, we've done a lot together, particularly in 2005, when we collaborated on the reform of the United Nations. He in his capacity as President of General Assembly, and I as the Secretary General at the time. It was a challenging period, but we managed to get a few things done, and I'm sure we'll be able to touch on some of that during our discussions this afternoon. But let me say that often when I meet with young people, they ask me, how did you become a Secretary General? When did you decide you were going to become Secretary General? At what stage in your life? And I try to explain to them that I wasn't one of those kids who at the age of 15 knew exactly what he was going to do. I did not set out to be Secretary General. In fact, I had not expected to be Secretary General because no one had been appointed from amongst the staff to really become Secretary General. And so when I became Under Secretary General for peacekeeping operation, I assumed that was the end of my UN career as far as I could go. And of course, there were developments which led to my being selected Secretary General. And when I became Secretary General, of course, there are lots of questions you have to ask yourself. And I was determined that we should open up the organization, that even though the charter was written in the name of we the peoples, it had become more or less a club of sovereign states who saw it as their prerogative. And the way the organization had evolved, except for organizations like UNICEF and others, with the UN proper, often the people were nowhere to be found. And I decided to open up the organization by reaching out to work with civil society, private sector, universities, foundations, and some ambassadors, and I know there are plenty in this room, you were not there then, asked me, Mr. Secretary General, who gave you the mandate to bring in civil society and all the outsiders? And I said, well, look at the first chapter of your charter. It starts with we the peoples. And we the peoples were outside, yeah, that's it. The peoples were outside the glass building, and if we want to reach out to them, we need to engage them. But I also had to ask myself a couple of questions. What can the UN do? What should the UN do? What should the UN do alone? What should the UN do with others? And what should the UN leave others to do? And by looking at this, the way I did it also allowed us to establish partnership and linkages with other institutions, allowing us to expand our capacity because we didn't have the means nor the resources to do it, and really began to work in close partnership with many institutions. I also took over almost at the end of the Cold War, a few years after the end of the Cold War. And the organization was going through incredible changes, particularly in the field of peacekeeping operations. Up till that time, peacekeeping operations were limited to interstate conflicts. We never got involved in civil wars. It was difficult to get agreements between the East and West on certain peacekeeping mandates, and it was particularly difficult even to contemplate getting agreement on civil war mandates, because most of these civil wars were also sponsored by one side or the other, and they were often protected by the client states. But after the collapse of the wall, we were encouraged. In fact, my predecessor, Boutros Ghali, did a report for the Council, and one of the recommendations was most of the conflicts we were witnessing these days was intrastate conflict. And if the UN is going to make a difference, it had to get involved in that. The decision was taken by the Council, but they did not follow up with the implication that if you are going to get into civil war situations, you are in a completely different ball game. The soldiers had to go in better equipped, prepared to take on all eventualities. We'd made the switch, but continued to operate as if it was traditional peacekeeping. In no time, we were in trouble in Somalia, in Rwanda, and in Bosnia, in former Yugoslavia, where the nature of the conflict was such that classic peacekeeping operation and classic attitude of neutrality didn't work. In fact, where you have, as some will put it, evil and good sitting side by side, if you remain impartial or neutral, you are siding with evil. And that you have to be partial or apply the rules in a way that you can balance things out. We learned lots of lessons from Srebrenica to Rwanda. And for me as an individual, I walked around wondering, how do we avoid another Rwanda? How do we avoid another Srebrenica? And that was one of the struggles that led me to propose to the General Assembly in 1999 that we should look into the question of what we do when we are confronted with another Rwanda. Do we sit back or do we take action? And it is this reflection that led to the concept of responsibility to protect. After my appearance at the General Assembly raising the conflict, a commission was set up by the Canadians that came up with a report, Responsibility to Protect. And as part of my 2005 report in Larger Freedom, I proposed the concept of responsibility to protect, which was endorsed by member states. And of course, is very much a topic of the day, given what is happening around our world. We also did lots of work in the Middle East, and in those days when we referred to Middle East, originally we were talking of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but in no time, Middle East had become, we had to look at what we call the larger Middle East, from Iraq to Iran, to Syria, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and you can even stretch it to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And of course today, North Africa is also linked up, but in the discussions, I will have the opportunity of saying more about that. But the UN did play an important role in the region. It was the UN that monitored the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon, which was an important achievement, and we certified the blue line that Israel had withdrawn. It was the UN that pressed for the withdrawal of Syrian troops from Lebanon, as well as Syrian security forces, to give Lebanon back its independence. Of course, we went through the issue of I had to deal with the issue of American hegemony, and every Secretary General has to deal with that. How do you handle a country that sees itself as the only superpower and its relations with the rest of the world and the rest of the world's relationship with it? And I sometimes found myself explaining the US to them and the rest of the world to the US. And it's an important role for the Secretary General. And then of course came 9/11, which changed things. What exactly 9/11 changed is sometimes debatable. Americans will say it changed the world. Others will say it changed America and its relations with the world and the way it related to the world, and created problems for the US and for all of us. And of course, today we are looking at Arab Spring, which in its exciting days was shared by almost everybody, that people are demanding a say in how they are governed and by whom. and that one should support this. And I must say, right from the beginning, I had some concerns in the sense that we were creating the impression that the street was alternative to elections. The street was alternative to parliament. And I was concerned that if you did that, you're undermining democracy and institutional rule. Because if you have a voting population of about 45 million, and you get 3, 4, 5 people into the streets, and the government is changed, what happens next time when somebody else manages to get another 5 or 6 million? And in fact, we are seeing the consequences of creating the impression that the street is an alternative to elections or parliament. We've seen it in Egypt. Now the pressure is on in Tunisia to see a similar change. Let me conclude by saying that Jan and I agree on one thing, that to create a healthy democratic society, you need to build on 3 pillars. It has to be, you have to have peace and stability, economic development, and finally, rule of law and respect for human rights. You cannot have sustained development without stability, and you cannot have stability without development, and both have to be rooted in rule of law and respect for human rights. If we had met 3, 5 years ago and I had asked my friends in this room, what do you think of Tunisia? I probably would have heard, great country, great tourist destination, peaceful, wonderful climate, is stable, and economically they are doing well. But most people will not raise the issue of rule of law and respect for human rights. But it is lack of that pillar, the weakness of that 3rd pillar, that led to the events we are seeing in that part of the world, from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya and now Syria. And I will say more about that. My 7 minutes is up, so I'll pause here and we'll continue. Thank you very much.
Your Royal Highness, Rector Magnifica, honored guest, Governor, dear friends, I'm happy to be back. I'm coming home. I feel very much at home here in this place, having served as visiting professor in Uppsala, and to be at the side of my dear and respected friend, Kofi Annan, is a particular pleasure and honor. We actually have known each other, I just realized it's 27 years ago when I met you and Nan, who is here, Mrs. Annan, in New York. You were a powerful director of budget, I think, at the time. We kept contact, but we became very close. And then, by coincidence, or maybe by some fate, my wife, Kerstin, who is sitting at your side, was classmate with Nan. So they were 8 years in school together. So we had this personal bond from the very beginning, and it's been a wonderful asset, I think, during our cooperation, during the years that we have also been friends and felt personal loyalty and kinship to each other. Some serious situations we worked with together. When I was Under Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs, you were at that time Under Secretary-General for Peacekeeping. We dealt with the absolutely horrific situation in Somalia, which I still have in front of me and has marked my life very much, the horrors of that war. And you and I were working together on that conflict back in 1992, 1993. Then, of course, you sent me off to see Saddam Hussein back in the late 90s together with Lakhdar Brahimi, to try to avoid some type of disaster that was looming. And then you also appointed me special envoy in Darfur just before you left. And I spent 1.5 years on that issue. This apart from the cooperation on the reform year, 2005 and 6. So I, of course, take as a starting point your book, interventions, a life in war and peace. And there are some themes there that I think we should bring out here today. One is the one you ended with. I was going to mention that, but now you made the case. There is no peace without development, no development without peace, and none of the above without respect of human rights and rule of law. But what I would just like to add, and I think you agree, we talked about this earlier, we have to do all this at the same time. You can't say that first you have peace, then you have development, and then you have human rights. No, it doesn't work. We have to do it at the same time. It's like 3 pillars. If one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure falls apart. That I've seen in Darfur, and you've seen it all over. So we really have to break down the walls between these areas and cooperate across the borders, not only borders, national borders, but also in terms of functions. The work on peace security is related to development, and of course human rights and rule of law. So that's a huge task for your students. You have to almost be Renaissance personalities, or at least, if I may put it that way, you must cooperate and build alliances and work together with others who influence the realities on the ground. The second theme that I would like to just bring out here is something that I'm working with every day now in the UN as Deputy Secretary-General, and that is the new developments in the area of peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is traditionally to be at a ceasefire line, observe, playing a neutral position. But in today's world, with civil wars, as you mentioned, and the very unclear line between parties and dealing with the civil wars as related to the international wars, we are often inside countries and having on the other side groups that are not the traditional groups with which you have an agreement. You may have people who are, like in Mali, extremist group, terrorist groups even, and United Nations runs the risk of becoming part of the conflict because it's hard to be neutral when you are attacked by terrorists. And we have the same problem also in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And therefore the UN is also developing a more muscular capacity in Mali and in DRC. And that is a great challenge to deal with this, that we change the face of peacekeeping. It's much more complicated than I remember it, even in the days when you and I worked on Somalia. The last point that I think is worth bringing out here is what I would call the tension between sovereignty and solidarity. We all feel desperate, don't we, when we see the genocide situations, when we see the ethnic cleansing, when we see the mass killings, and we realize that actually the border of solidarity is the territorial border. We don't have the authority to get into a conflict unless the Security Council decides. Otherwise, it is interference in internal affairs. And much of the public opinion problems that the United Nations is facing is due to the fact that people feel, why doesn't the United Nations do something about this? And you, of course, think about Syria today, but we have had those situations so many times in the past. And there, your path-breaking work, and I carried it on as president to get it through in the General Assembly for Responsible Protect, is a first step. That we state, and the member states of the world have agreed, that every state is responsible for the safety of its own population. We must protect our own population. It's a basic requirement. But the difficulty starts when you ask the question, what if they don't do that? How do you then deal with it? Well, then it's the international community, and after some convoluted paragraphs, which I'm guilty of myself in the decision 2005, it comes back to the Security Council again.
That's true.
So in the Syria case, you come back to the lack of unity in the Security Council, which you did not have in the Libya case, by the way. I think I would stop there and ask you, Kofi, where would you like to pick up on these themes? You have You can pick up on the sovereignty, you can pick up on your peacekeeping, you can pick up on the holistic, the comprehensive, that everything has together. But where do you start where you like, and then I'll try to follow you.
No, I think you're absolutely right that peacekeeping has evolved and it has changed. But our thinking and attitudes have not kept up with the change. Once you move into a civil war situation, you have to accept the fact that you'll be operating in an unpredictable, fluid situation. You have to be prepared for the fact that the soldiers will be challenged, that there may be no rules or necessarily disciplined soldiers that you may be dealing with. You have to accept the fact that there will be casualties, and governments have to prepare their people for casualties if they deploy into peacekeeping operations. For a long time, governments created the impression, and we at the UN were also involved, created the impression that peacekeeping was a risk-free operation, with the end result that when they deploy troops and several get killed, the government withdraws its troops. It happened with the US in Somalia. Black Hawk down, and the US troops were out. In Congo, during the Rwandan crisis, 10 Belgian soldiers were killed, and they withdrew, and the operation almost collapsed. So we need to really rethink, and particularly if the UN is going to give these soldiers robust mandates, asking them to fight, to protect the civilians, they have to have the capacity, and the others will fight back. And I think the other question, the comment I would want to make is the role of the Security Council. In some of these issues, particularly in a situation like Syria, where the Council is divided, it becomes extremely difficult for the UN to make a difference. And here I would appeal to our friends in the media when they talk about the failure of UN in situations like Syria, they should be clear which UN they are talking about, because there are two UNs. The UN that is a secretariat that carries out the mandate given to it by the member states, and the UN that is member states, the UN that is the Security Council, the General Assembly that provides the mandates and the resources to carry out. When they don't have the will and they cannot agree on mandate, there's very little the Secretary-General or the Deputy Secretary-General can do. Today we are confronted with a situation in Syria where I myself was an envoy up till June last year. I did it for 6 months and stepped back because at the first Geneva conference, I thought we came up with a very effective package where there was agreement that the only solution was political settlement that will protect the interests of all the groups, that would ensure that the governmental structures were working reasonably well, security forces were given effective leadership, and that we should do everything to avoid a collapsed state. I had expected the member states to go to New York and work on that. All the foreign ministers or the permanent members were at the Geneva meeting. They went back to New York and started calling each other names and finger pointing, and did not build on what they achieved in Geneva. And then I realized those who gave me the job were not as serious. Today we see a situation where there's lots of agitation and anger about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We knew the situation was going to get worse, not better. If our young friends in this room were to ask me, 100,000 Syrian lives have been lost, what has been the response from the Security Council and the international community? 2 million refugees have left Syria. 5 million Syrians are internally displaced and need help. what has been done and what should be done. Obviously, today there's debate going on about punishing those who use the chemical weapons, and I think it's unacceptable, it's brutal, and we should deal with those who were found responsible and held to account. But that should not be the aim. We should see what happened in Syria as one more urgent reason to take steps to come together to end the conflict, to look for a political solution and look for peace and end the nightmare and the despair of the Syrian people. Yes, the chemical weapons killed 14,000 people, according to the figures released by the US government. But isn't the killing of a man much more important than how he is killed? And really, we need to focus on the main issue of stopping the violence, the killing, and I hope the Council will find the leadership. And last year, when I stepped down, I said we needed leadership, particularly from President Obama and Putin, and that situation still stands. And I hope they'll find a way of getting people around the table to organize Geneva too.
Thank you. I remember those days in August last year when you expressed your frustration about the lack of unity in the Security Council. And I also felt that lack of muscular power that I mentioned earlier for you and now for Lakhdar Brahimi. When you don't have a strong resolution in the Security Council, you are very much weakened in your mission. And you felt it, of course, and we still feel the pain of that. So here you are left with doing what we can do and our mandate to do, and that is to do as much as we can on the humanitarian situation. And you described the horrors as they are. I'm in contact every day with the field to see what we can do. I'm particularly worried about the refugee situation, how it is evolving into Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, in particular Turkey, of course, also. But with the horrific aspect, one of the horrific aspects of this war is that it has strengthened the sectarian, religious, ethnic dimensions. Many Syrians don't speak about themselves anymore as Syrians. They speak about themselves as Alawites or Kurds or Sunnis or Druze, Christians. And you lose then that sense of national identity. And if you then go sectarian, if I may say so, then that goes right across the borders into Lebanon. So it's an enormously dangerous situation. Secretary Ban Ki-moon and I, we talk about this every day, and our frustration is very deep. We did what we were asked to do. We sent the inspectors there, and we should be proud of our countryman Åke Sällström, by the way. His group of cars was shot at the first day, and they just went back to the base, picked up another car, found another way to get in there. I'm glad they didn't ask me for permission. But they did their job, and we hope now that they will be able to finish their job, do the analysis, and then that we will have facts that we can build upon. And we hope also that perhaps this could serve, as you hinted, I think, as an alarm clock to realize that we have to go to the basic issues, to the basic problem. And we have prepared the Geneva meeting. You had really a successful meeting, 30th of June. I wish they had built on that, that agreement. And now Lakhdar Brahimi is preparing the ground for another meeting in Geneva, but we need, of course, then political will, both from the parties to stop believing in a military solution. I hope you saw the quotation marks. There is really practically never any real military solution. It just will be another problem. There is only one way out, and that is a negotiated transition, which was the formula that you devised back in 30th of June. I suppose if the talks get started, they would start where you ended, on the 30th of June. So
30th of June last year.
Last year.
This year.
In the meantime, you have these sacrifices. So now is a moment of really deep thought, deep consideration. What are the best steps to take to find unity in the Security Council based on facts and then go to the root causes and start dealing with this issue.
Yeah.
Can I just say something else? Because out of my frustration comes an even stronger belief in Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, Pacific settlement of disputes.
Yeah.
We so easily land into those situations. We let the fire go on, and we don't realize that we have to be there when the smoke develops, or better, when the arsonist reaches for the match. We should follow this Chapter 6 with the power of the word, the power of diplomacy, act early, because, for instance, the Syria crisis, it has got so much worse. For every week, every month, the problems of extremists on the side of the opposition was not a problem for 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And the ethnic and sectarian elements were not that strong. It was demonstration on the street. Now we have a very, very difficult issue to solve. But the lesson for me is, let us really strengthen Chapter 6.
Yeah.
Peter Wallensteen, you should, with your wonderful institution, really have depth studies into Article 33. This is the poetry for a diplomat, you know. Can you imagine? Or for a lawyer, the parties to any dispute shall first of all seek a solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies arrangement, or other peaceful means of their own choice. How often do we do this? Yeah. This is, when finally this nightmare is over, I think those basic questions have to be asked.
And in fact, when you talk of responsibility to protect, most people think you have to use force.
No,
and force is a last resort. And in fact, in my judgment, the best application of responsibility to protect was what we did in Kenya. In fact, Hans Corell was with me then, where everybody cooperated. The mandate came from the African Union. My former president, Kufuor, is here. He was then chairman of the African Union and gave me the mandate. He called me very innocently saying, I need advice. But he was going to give me an impossible job and asked me to take on this question of mediation of Kenya with two others, Graça Machel, the wife of President Mandela, and the former President Ben Mkapa of Tanzania. And we got cooperation from everybody, and we were able to help them stop the killing without any threat or resort to force.
Thank you. As you can hear, we can go on for a long time and listening to these discussions, and I think they are important issues that we pursue, all of us. Now, for many of you listening to this, it may become a bit depressing. So I'd like to ask one question to the gentleman here. Do you have a good advice for young people that are interested in doing something in the world for peace and security? What should we do if we are, again, young, or the young people that you see in front of you? Mr. Annan.
I talk to young people a lot. In fact, I have a program called Kofi Annan Dialogues Live, where we talk to young people around the world. And I must say, I've been amazed by their enthusiasm, creativity, and desire to do something and to contribute. And today, if I have hope, it's because of them. And often they ask me, what should I do to become a good global citizen? And my answer always is, it begins in your community. Starts at your university, in your village, in your city, whatever you can do with friends, when you can organize yourself to tackle a problem that you see. It doesn't have to be a big issue. You can start with things that you can manage to handle. And of course, it's sometimes also our fault when we throw things like Syria at them. It seems so hopeless or impossible. They all think they are being asked to resolve those issues. But it could be things in your community, even in school, where somebody is bullying someone. And just for you to stop and say, enough, stop it. This is simply not done. Gives the person being bullied the courage to fight back and for them to do this. So the energy and the hope and the creativity I see from the young people give me a sense that they may probably do better than my generation has done. And I would also encourage them not to wait to lead. You have it in you. You know when you are ready to act. You know when you are ready to do something about a problem. It doesn't have to be a question of age. Do it. And sometimes we, the older ones, use age to keep our privileges. You wait your turn. You are not old enough. But I've seen remarkable things done by, they are changing our world. With technology, with all these things, is coming from the young people. And, but we need to be careful not to think that technology solves all problems. People refer to the Arab Spring as an internet revolution. It's not an internet. Internet was a tool. It was a group of people wanting to change things. I don't know what the tool will be 10 years from now. But in 1989, the tool was fax. The government closed down the system and the students kept in touch with each other through faxes. So I would encourage the young people to be bold, to lead, to challenge us, and don't let age stop you. It was Reagan who said, I won't use the youth of my opponent against him, but you should also not allow us to use age to intimidate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I give you a little warning, because if you get addicted to this type of work, you will never give up. It's a drug. It's going to be a drug in your veins. But go for it, and never give up, and stick to your convictions. I was thinking the other day that I usually say I'm an optimist, but I always now add I'm an optimist, but I worry a lot. I worry a lot. And then I asked myself, what is it that I believe in for the future? And I said to myself, young people, the women's, finally, empowerment this century, I think is going to be absolutely historic. Thirdly, science, research, knowledge. And lastly, international cooperation. Those are the 4 sources of hope for me. And then I also want to be, I think by every year I become more practical. I say, let's get yourself something very practical to work on. President Kofi Annan and I have one thing in common with the water and sanitation issue. It's so liberating to go for something such concrete where you see results on the ground. And I think when you get sometimes confused by the enormity of the problems that you're facing, you should sort of choose something that you believe in very much and go for that. You can't do everything. And I usually say nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And I think that is my most simple advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter.
Yes?
May I just remind us of one thing before we leave, because there is a tendency, because of the way these issues are covered, as if the UN exists to preserve international peace. That is very important, and it is a major role for the UN. But it also has another role, and that role, and I quote, is to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and the worth of the human person. So it's very much part of our work, and I think sometimes when we talk of the council and all this, we tend to forget that part.
Thanks for reminding us. I will now open up the floor for some questions, and I'm sure we are going to get further expansion on these ideas that you mentioned. There are some microphones around here. Where are they? You are the microphone man, good. Okay, there are 2 of you, perfect. The first one I'll ask to come and take the microphone is Ms. Annika Söder, right down there, please. She is the Executive Director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, which is part of organizing the annual Dag Hammarskjöld lecture. And for those of you who haven't seen it, the next Hammarskjöld lecture will be next week, right here, with Margot Wallström as the speaker. So, Annika Söder, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, doctors, for a very, very interesting conversation. It's a pleasure for me, as the head of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, also to meet again with Kofi Annan and to mention to all of you that we are partners with the Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana.
Good.
Also for you, Mr. President.
That's good.
And we do that cooperation, of course, in the spirit of Dag Hammarskjöld trying to contribute to peace-building efforts in the world. Dag Hammarskjöld said that the UN is not there to take us to paradise, but to save us from hell. And I think that part of your conversation here today has actually been about how to save us from hell. On a more optimistic note, I'd like to repeat what was said about all the achievements under your leadership when it comes to sustainable development, the recognition of development in the world that the Millennium Development Goals meant, and how that put economic and social and environmental development on the agenda. And you made full use of the window of opportunity that we had in that time. Now we know that the political climate is different. We speak in our foundation about global disorders, but we add, is this a possibility for a new global order? We see power shifts, we see new actors, we see problems related to trade, migration, and I think many of the young friends here are very concerned about how we are dealing and stretching the planetary boundaries. We in our countries here in the Nordic part of the world are very strong believers in multilateral solutions. We think this could be easy if we all agreed to partner, to work for the common good now when we're more interdependent than ever for many, many reasons. And I would like both of you to explain to us why this Nordic approach is not prevailing and what can be done, who can champion, what can we do to have an approach where we actually save the planet and also save lives since we are the world together. Thank you.
Yes,
I will ask my Nordic in-law to go first.
I don't know where to start, but I'm glad you brought up the Millennium Development Goals and the need for development and the need to now really start to think very deeply about the road ahead. We have been greatly helped by those MDGs during these years, 2000 to 2015, but we need to think what is the road ahead and what are the elements in the road ahead. And there, I'm pretty sure we will have to continue to work with poverty eradication. I'm pretty sure we will have to add sustainability. We may have plan B in life, but we certainly have no planet B. So sustainability dimension has to be there, they have to come together. And then I think there is an element which brings in the Nordic model, if I may say so, and that is the power of institutions, the power of rule of law. Yeah. If I were to be self-critical of our policies in the 70s on, for instance, development cooperation, I would say we should perhaps have been tougher on setting up institutions. When I now come back from Afghanistan, Somalia, and see that there has been no institution building that has kept the country's development on course, then I look back at our own country. 80 years ago, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe. What happened? Well, there was a change of political direction generally in the country and among public opinion. What happened? We created strong, honest institutions. We created a strong infrastructure, and we had a fair and good education system which was the benefit of all. These were the three structural factors. And I think we need to bring that into the discussion on the road ahead. Poverty eradication, sustainability, and good institutions, rule of law. I think that would be what I would hope would come out of that process that is just now starting among member states. Yeah. And I think the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation can play a role in creating a debate, a discourse about these issues and how they are interrelated. Thank you.
No, No, I agree with Jan that the Millennium Development Goals have been very important. And important not only in terms of fighting poverty, but it also had impact on conflicts. You cannot have a world where you have immense wealth and extreme poverty sitting side by side and expect nothing to give. And so right from the beginning, I also saw economics sometimes as basis for conflict when people are fighting over scarce resources or inadequate resources. And so helping to lift their conditions and giving them education and sharing good health was a way of also helping. Through the Millennium Development Goals, we energized the development process and came up with goals which were simple enough for the average man or woman in Lagos or Delhi or Santiago to understand and to put pressure on their leaders to give it to them. I think we also need to accept that there has to be reform and changes in the way, in the machinery we have for governing our world. One of my biggest disappointments was the failure to help reform the Security Council before I left. The Security Council has to be reformed. Its structures today reflects the geopolitical realities of 1945. Those permanent members with privileges will have to realize that they have to give some of it up or allow space for others to come in. It is extremely difficult today to explain why India, with over 1 billion population, doesn't have a seat. Why Africa, with 54 countries, doesn't have a single permanent seat. Why Latin America doesn't have a single permanent seat, and Europe has 3. If the reforms do not take place, and I think from your question, you were wondering how we can cooperate better. If these changes do not take place to allow them space at the table, we are going to get into even more destructive competition. If we want cooperation, we have to reform. The powerful will have to decide how much power they are ready to give up to make the participation of others meaningful. If they don't, a time will come when some of these powerful emerging nations may ignore their decisions.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Now let's go to another Secretary General, the one of the Swedish UN Association, Mrs. Linda Nordin. Where are you? Up there.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you very much, Kofi Annan and Jan Eliasson, for a most interesting lecture. As you know, UNA Sweden is a people's movement for the UN, working with peace, development, and human rights. Now, on the topic of Syria and the important principle of R2P, I was wondering if you see the resolution Uniting for Peace as a way forward for legality and a legitimate action, maybe also to prevent a new fork in the road within global cooperation. And my second question would be on the issue of UN-led missions. In the last few years, we have seen less and less Western countries participating and contributing with troops to UN-led missions. In Sweden, for example, we only have 28 now, but we shall be sending another 70 to Mali. How can we convince EU and other Western countries to provide more troops to UN-led missions? Thank you.
I could give. Yes, well, two very good questions. On the first one, there have been votes and debates and even votes in the General Assembly on Syria twice. I think once happened when you were doing the mediation, once with Lakhdar Brahimi, with a very large majority in favor of the political solution and the Geneva process and so forth. There is now speculation whether member states will raise the issue in the context of uniting for peace. I have left New York Thursday and I haven't seen any such signs yet. But it's, I think, an expression of the frustration that the Security Council has not come to a decision that such discussion comes about. It has happened only rarely in the past. It was in the Korea War, I think. Of course, the Security Council probably disputes the legal caliber of that element. But it's an interesting issue. We will see what the member states do. The second question is the participation in peacekeeping operations. And I must admit, and I hope I can do that, I have more restrictions than you here, because I'm an international civil serving right now. But I would definitely say that I would hope that the European countries who were so strong on peacekeeping would regain their position. I think it's not healthy to have so few Europeans, for instance, in the African conflicts. And I would hope that our peacekeeping should, in principle, reflect the universal nature of this organization. I would hope that, again, we, in the European Union, I say we, they, I'm now international civil servant. But I think you make a very good point, and I think your organization has indeed advocated very strongly for this, and I hope you will be listened to.
I would just comment on the first part about uniting for peace. And of course, Syria concerns everybody. And I think over and above the issue, as you point out, of uniting for peace, I think we should all insist on rule of law. Countries have a right to defend themselves when they are attacked or they believe it is imminent to defend themselves. But when it is an issue of a broader issue of international peace and security, it has to be the Security Council that authorizes action. It's only the Security Council that can offer legitimacy. And if we do not respect these limits, we can get ourselves into a situation where it becomes a free-for-all. If one country or group of countries constantly ignore the Council and take action, what prevents other countries from deciding to do the same? And then what happens to the security system we've set up to protect ourselves since World War II when it begins to unravel? Where do we turn then? And so the insistence on rule of law and application of international law, I think, is extremely important. I know Hans Corell is going to make comments, and I'm not a lawyer, and I should leave it to those who are better trained. Thank you.
I would add, and I hope Hans doesn't protest, but there are two cases where use of force is legally acceptable. One is Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right of self-defense.
That's correct.
And the other one is when the Security Council authorizes use of force. And that's where the problem is, which we have come back to several times. Yeah. When the Security Council doesn't have the unity and doesn't produce that basis for our action, then we are in the situation which we just described on Syria.
Thank you. I think that helps us understand a little more. Let me open up for questions from the audience. You have to raise your hands pretty high, and as I said, I will give priority to students for the time being we have. There is a gentleman there I can't see who it is, but if you give him the microphone, we'll find out who it is. So I will ask you to identify yourself. And then there is one there, yes. Okay, we'll take this one first.
Thank you. My name is Johan Brochet, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research. I have a question related to causes of peace. Since gaining independence, most African countries has experienced war at some time, and Southern Africa has been particularly torn by conflict. We see that in Angola, Mozambique, and Congo. However, Botswana, Malawi, and Zambia has constituted an island of peace, whereas the neighboring countries has been torn by conflict. I wonder if you have any ideas why you think that is the case, and what we can learn from these peaceful countries.
That's for you.
No, I think that the reasons for that also comes from the historical colonial experiences. When the countries you mentioned, Angola, Mozambique, Congo, had very difficult independence struggle, particularly Angola and Mozambique, which led to internal disputes between two groups, and the way the colonial power withdrew led to very serious and protracted internal debate. Tanzania, Botswana, and the countries you are referring to did not have that experience. Zimbabwe had that experience, they had their independence, but the Southern African was where you had the freedom fighters, and they often linked up with each other. And so it's really it's a continuation of pre-independence struggle, which sometimes leads into post-independence political arrangements, and it becomes very bitter. But I'm happy to say that from economic point of view, both countries seem to be relatively stable and are doing reasonably well. Angola is considered one of the fastest growing economies, and Mozambique is going to join. So the reason is mainly historical. But I should also add, and I think Peter Wallensteen would agree with me, that there are fewer civil wars on the continent today than there were 10 years ago.
That's true, yes.
Yeah.
We have facts. Jan, would you like to comment?
No, I would rather leave room for the floor. I have no comments to make. It's the expert on this one on my left side.
Okay, there is a gentleman over here on the aisle here. Can give him the microphone. Please identify yourself.
Hello, and thank you, Jan Eliasson and Kofi Annan, for this great lecture. My name is Fredrik Eliasson. I'm the program secretary of the Uppsala Association of International Affairs, and we're very happy to be a part organizing this lecture. We're a student organization spreading debate and interest and knowledge about international affairs, so we're very happy to be here. I have a question for you, Mr. Annan. What do you wish, is there anything you wish you would have known when you started your work as UN Secretary-General that you know today?
Sounds like an innocent and easy question. but it really isn't. There were moments when I wish I had realized and knew how little support when it came to the crunch that you will get from your member states. And in fact, as I learned more about this, that you cannot assume that they belong, it is their organization, they appointed you, and the support on critical issues would always be forthcoming. You also realize that the sort of network we established with civil society and others became very helpful. In fact, I used to call the civil society people the fire throwers. They can say and do things that I as Secretary General couldn't do. but sometimes they prepare the way for us. They were the icebreakers. So you work with them as well. And, but if I had known what I discovered about this, the softness of governmental support on certain key questions, I would have engaged civil society and used them even much more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it too early to ask a similar question to you, Jan?
Same question?
Yes.
That was
something you wish you would have known.
I sort of took it off my brain, so what do I do? No, I'm absolutely obsessed with the need for prevention. I did the humanitarian work in Somalia. I was in 6 wars and mediation, and I just feel that it is so frustrating that we don't act early on. I don't understand why, because it's so obvious that we should. We save lives, we save money, we save our reputation of our organization, and we save a night's sleep. If we were to act early on, we would have a tremendous difference. But there is something psychological in the human mind. It seems as though we don't want to face a problem before it turns critical. It's only when you see the dying children in the burning houses that you realize it's a problem. We should listen to the first sounds, the first vibrations in the ground of a conflict erupting, the first violations of human rights. The father is tortured, the kids don't go to school. Well, that's the beginning of a conflict. And that goes also in the development area, where there's a food crisis, drought in America or Russia or Thailand. We know the food prices will go up. It doesn't matter for you, for us. 15% of our salary is used for food, normally in a Western rich country. While for the person who lives with $1.50 a day, it's life and death. And then you know there's going to be a food crisis. And human rights, of course, perfect tool for identifying crises. So I would ask you all, the young people in particular, try to do the prevention. If you move the focus from the late stage to a conflict to an early one, that's almost an historic task. And I'm actually disappointed that we haven't done that enough in the UN. We tried, you tried. UN, actually Anna Lindh was, Anna Lena Wallén were very active, and we brought to the European Union. You took it up in your programs, but still we have so much more to do, and I think we should, here is a great task for you in the academic community to find these methods of identifying early signals. And the media, if media is here, I wonder if any of the journalists can prove to me the point that you have a headline on the first page or in the first item on the television where it says, the disaster did not occur.
Thank you both very much. I'm sure, I know there are more questions, more things that we would like you to reflect on. I'm sure we could spend the whole night here, but all good things have to come to an end. And the one who will help us to summarize what we have just heard is, as you know, Mr. Hans Corell. So I ask Mr. Hans Corell to take the floor and give his concluding remarks. Please, welcome.
Your Royal Highness, Mr. Governor, Rector Magnifica, my friends, Kofi, Jan, and Peter. Uppsala studenter. It gives me great pleasure to be here, and I will try to sum up this discussion. For those who do not understand Swedish, Uppsala studenter is the call that the curator curatorum uses when he speaks to the assembled students up at the bell at Uppsala Castle, which was the home of Dag Hammarskjöld in those days. Well, it's interesting. I joined the foreign ministry in 1984, and Jan Eliasson was head of the political department. So we are, in a sense, old UN colleagues, old foreign ministry colleagues. And exactly 10 years later, I came to the UN, and one of my colleagues was the Under Secretary-General for Peacekeeping, Kofi Annan. And then, of course, he was elected Secretary-General. And on the 1st of January 1997, Kofi became Mr. Secretary-General, not as a flatter, but a constant reminder that we were friends, yes, but we had to keep our positions and advise our colleague who raised to this position in the same way as we advised the former Secretary-General Boutros Boutros-Ghali. So for 7 years I served with Kofi Annan as the legal counsel of the UN. And then, of course, as you heard, in Kenya, for 5.5 years, on a daily basis, you receive the latest news from your office down in Nairobi. Copy goes to me here in Stockholm. It has been a fantastic experience, and the skill which you approached that as chairman of the panel of eminent African personalities who was engaged in the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation. I must say, first of all, I had the privilege of reading your book, Interventions, A Life in War and Peace. And that gave me a lot to think about because I had experienced much of this, but still to see it presented in this way was fascinating. And then, of course, the book is translated into Swedish, Interventioner, ett liv i FNs tjänst. And I know that we have the translator, Margareta Eklöf, here in the Aula Magna, so let's recognize her presence also. My reflections when I read that book, that this is something that they should use in academia for students that study political science and civics, because it's contemporary history, and also it gives you an idea of what happens behind the scenes. So I must say it was an extraordinary experience to read this book. Now, you have noticed perhaps that a constant concept or constant concepts mentioned here is the rule of law and human rights. And note that this is mentioned by persons who are not lawyers. As a lawyer, of course, I rejoice. Because basically, when I look at my experience from the courts, from the Ministry of Justice, Foreign Office, and 10 years in the UN, and now after that period, I must say that if I look at a conflict somewhere in the world and ask the question, why is there a conflict? The answer is the same in every case. No democracy, no rule of law. That is a recipe for a conflict. And that's why it's so important to instill these elements. And of course, we started working very early on this. In 1989, there was a decade of international law. In 1995, there was a conference on international law under the legal, with the legal office involved. And then Kofi Annan, who came, as you heard, as Secretary General in 1997, although not a lawyer, I must say I was impressed by the way he understood the importance of instilling rule of law and a concept of the law in the discussions. And we started to develop a system back in 1999. I actually went back on my cron file to see the memos that we sent around, and where we developed this program that eventually Kofi Annan brought forward, and eventually he brought it to the attention of the General Assembly, and the end result of this process was that a unit was created in the Office of the Secretary General, the Rule of Law Unit, and that unit is now under the supervision of Jan Eliasson. And to me, imagine the head of the former political department talking so much about law. That's something. That's something. But this should not be a joke. It's a very, very serious message on my part here. And I have jotted down quite a few words here from the discussion. Syria and Kosovo. Of course, if you go to Kofi Annan's book, you will find that he discusses the situation there in Kosovo. We can't go into detail here, I have only 5 minutes. But if you do that, you will see the similarity here, a situation where some states, or one state maybe in this case, will act without the authority of the United Nations Security Council. And this is something that I have been so concerned with. I remember that in Canada in 1999, when the Kosovo conflict was over, I actually pulled out a quotation here which tallies extremely well with what Kofi and Jan has said here. I said at the annual meeting in October, in an address, from territorial sovereignty to human security, in the exercise of their duties, the members of the Council will in the future act under the eyes of an increasingly well-informed general public. I'm sure that the members of the Council would agree that they will have to act with credibility in these situations, or else they may leave others with no other choice but to act on their own in disregard of the letter of the Charter. At the same time, will such action providing that is proportionate in the eyes of the general public, be seen as a violation of its spirit? I think not. Seen in this perspective, the members of the Council have, in a sense, the same responsibility to protect the Charter and its viability as the national legislative organs have to protect the Constitution of the state. And I mean, this, I think, is just as valid today as when it was said in 1999. The key words here, I have several of them, but you notice the focus not on the rule of law and human rights, but also on the Security Council. And here, I must say, it is with great disappointment that I look at this council. This organ has a tremendous power, and we should have respect for the UN Charter. It was drafted by a generation that had experienced 2 world wars back in San Francisco in 1945. And we have the Security Council, and one can always discuss whether there should be vetoes, of course, but the vetoes are a political reality. And this is why the responsibility falls so heavily on the permanent members of the Security Council. Well, you heard the constant references here by both Kofi Annan and Jan Eliasson to the Council. I was so frustrated that on the 10th of December 2008, I wrote a letter to member states of the UN. And the title of that letter was Security Council Reform, Rule of Law More Important Than Additional Members. And in that letter, I had 4 proposals. Number 1, from now on, we are going to abide by the Charter. We have to bow to the law that we are set to supervise. And in particular, this was directed to the permanent 5 members. Number 2, from now on, we are not going to use our veto unless our innermost security concerns are at hand. And if we do, we'll explain why we do it. Number 3, we will not use force unless in the 2 situations that Jan Eliasson referred to a moment ago, self-defense, Article 51, or a clear and unambiguous mandate by the Security Council. And then number 4, the responsibility to protect that was instituted during Kofi Annan's tenure as Secretary-General of the United Nations. Now, if you look at those elements, the question is, had they followed this kind of advice, had Syria, could we have avoided Syria? And I think this is so very sad when you look at the situation. If the permanent 5 members sat down around a table, looked at each other and asked the question, what are we doing? Aren't we actually behaving in a manner that we are creating conflicts or supporting conflicts, instead of joining hands and sending the signal to the world that from now on we are going to act in unity if the rules of human rights are, shall we say, violated in the way they have been here. I have an idea, when I listen to the discussion here, for you here, students, and in particular Utrikespolitiska föreningen. You heard about ideas. Why don't you form a global movement here with all the technology and whatever it's called in the machines you have, and turn around the whole world and form a body that will turn directly to the permanent 5 members and tell them, why don't you do your duty under the UN Charter? You have to join hands. If we have situations where a government is starting to gas or bomb away a civilian population, including women and children, is this not passing a line that simply must not be passed in the 21st century? Why don't you send the message around to students elsewhere and form this focal message to the permanent 5 members of the Council? Do your duty under the UN Charter. Finally, let me also add here another element in particular, and that is empowerment of women. I can't see a more important issue, aside from what I just said about the Council, than empowerment of women. And Syria is so sad. I remember when Kofi Annan and Inger and I were sitting on the 22nd of April at our flat in Stockholm, discussing whether I could assist in Syria as I had assisted in Kenya. And we came to the conclusion that it was impossible because you didn't have the support of the Council and there were no parties to negotiate with. But Syria is part of the Arab world, and here I heard a lecture by a woman researcher who talked about the Arab Spring that risked to become the winter of the women. That's not possible. That's simply not acceptable. Also, when we come to reform of the Security Council, I think they only have a few years left. Kishore Mahbubani, former ambassador of Singapore to the UN, wrote a book about this, The Great Convergence. I recommend that book. And he says precisely this: you have to do your duty, Council, otherwise the whole system might collapse. Finally, on a more, shall we say, somber note here, after my positive, because you have to view the future positively, is the fact that I have lived on a daily basis with Dag Hammarskjöld for the last year. When you see the students down here in their white caps, the tails and the sash, that is exactly how I looked at Uppsala Cathedral that September day in 1961 when Dag Hammarskjöld was buried. The Hammarskjöld Commission, 4 members of which I am one, will present our report in the Peace Palace in The Hague on the 9th of September, just exactly in 1 week. Thank you for your attention.
Super. Thank you very much, Mr. Hans Corell, and indeed you gave a challenge to the student. You are part of a challenge when you are involved in this report that we look forward to read sometime next week. Let me now explain what is going to happen right now. We are going to have a small ceremony in the classical Uppsala style, which, as you know, is a solid, robust style. We will start with the Allmänna sången that will be directed by Maria Gondorina, as always. So the choir will come in here in any moment. They will sing one song. After that, Rector Magnifica will join me up here, and we will give some gifts to the 2 gentlemen, have another song, and that will then be the end of this afternoon. So I now invite the Allmänna sången to enter, and I hope they can hear me. Here they are. Yeah, it's fabulous. You can't speak after this. It's fantastic. What we heard, as you all can hear, was a Bruremarsch fra Valsøyfjord, or a wedding march from Norway. You could really hear it was Norwegian, yes. So now I'll ask the two gentlemen to come up to our Rector Magnifica, and I will begin with Mr. Annan. As a little way of appreciating your coming here to Uppsala, and Dr. Annan, you were one of the honorary doctors from 2007 in memory of Carl Linnaeus. Thus, we present you here with a portrait of Carl Linnaeus.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I thank you. Yeah. Good to see you again. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Very nice.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a portrait by Augustin Ehrensvärd from 1740, and the etchings have been printed more recently in 2006 from the original copper plate, which is part of a collection that belongs to Uppsala University. And this is actually print number 7 out of 20, so take care of it. Now for Mr. Eliasson, the rector is happy to give you a volume by Carl Frengsmyr on this particular beautiful main building that we are in right now, because it's now celebrating its 125th anniversary. And as you will see when looking in the book, a lot of events like these are portrayed in there, so you can see that what we have been doing this afternoon is not atypical. On the contrary, it's a tradition to use this for these kind of discussions. Now let's listen to the second piece by the Allmänna Sången, please. Thank you very much. This was very fittingly Benjamin Britten, Advanced Democracy. So we are now going to end this seminar, and I hope you will agree with me that we have dealt with the topic we said, the future of the United Nations. I hope you will also agree with me that with people like Mr. Annan and Mr. Eliasson and Mrs. Söder and Mrs. Nordin and Mr. Corell, we can feel a bit optimistic that the UN, there is a future for the UN. We want it to be even brighter, and that is a challenge to all of us to keep on working. So thank you for being with us, Jan Eliasson and Kofi Annan and all the others. And we are now going to walk out in the procession, and the music when we walk out is a procession march by William Harris, and it is our university organist, Mr. Andrew Canning, that is playing. And when we entered, he actually played March from King Arthur by Henry Purcell. So there you can see it all connects very well to the theme here. But when we walk out, I will ask all of you just to allow the procession to move out first, and then please do enjoy the music of Mr. Canning. So again, thanks for a great evening, thanks for your singing, and thanks for being with us this afternoon.